Hello everyone and welcome to this month's SETS online webinar. My name is Shraddha, and before we get started with today's session, we would like to thank our sponsorship from IAS, which allows us to offer all these resources free of charge. Make sure and check out our website for more info on upcoming events and meetings and to see everything available for the community. Today's talk is by Dr. John Nord, Senior Paleontologist at Stantec and President of Sedimental Services. He completed his master's and PhD in sedimentary geology from London University, UK, after which he has worked as an exploration manager and senior exploration geologist for Murphy Oil and Husky Energy and Shell International, wherein he led several exploration projects in the Middle East. He has over 20 years of experience in the field of oil and gas, mining, and marine geology industries, as well as 4 years of university level and industry teaching. His specializations include sedimentology, paleontology, exploration geology, and 3D reservoir modeling. In today's talk, he'll discuss about his new findings from terrestrial deposits of the Springbank Offstream Reservoir project. And with this introduction, I would request you to start the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Today I'm going to be talking about a project that's being undertaken just to the west of Calgary in Alberta. So right now, across the world, the construction industry is booming, and excavations are opening up unprecedented new outcrops across our province and beyond. So this is things like building new bridges, dams, flood defenses, communities as well. So new communities that they're excavating for to build the foundations for all the houses and for pipelines as well. And in Alberta, we're lucky enough to have what's called the Historical Resources Act, which has been updated several times. It was initiated in the 1970s, and this protects cultural heritage, and that includes paleontological resources like fossils and archaeological resources as well, historic and natural sites, structures and objects. And so if you want to do excavations in the province, then you need to make sure that there's going to be no damage done to these cultural resources. And so people like me will come out from companies like Stantec with a research permit, and that will allow us to be available to monitor what's going on site to make sure that no fossils or archaeological resources are damaged. And today I'm just going to take you through one project which links sedimentology, structural geology, and paleontology, and I'll show you all of the different kinds of data that have come out of this site over the last 3 years. So this is just a view of the project site early one morning when I went in for an early morning safety meeting, and you can just see in the foreground here we have some excavations, and in the background we have the Rocky Mountains, so that the location of the site is perfect. So the reason why this project went ahead was back in 2013, we had a major flood in Calgary. 100,000 people were evacuated. Fortunately, only one person was killed, but it was a very dramatic flood event. And it was estimated to cost around $6 billion in reparations for the post-flood redevelopment. They also declared a state of emergency, and at that time, it was Canada's costliest natural disaster. So because of this, they decided that they'd try and initiate some mitigation for the flooding, and that included handling the dams better, but also building this Springbank Offstream Reservoir. And the idea was that this would provide flood protection across one of the two rivers, and also would work with a reservoir close to the area of the project, which would accommodate the floodwaters. So this is the actual map of the project. So we're, as I said, we're located, you can see on the map here on the lower left, we have Calgary there, which is that area in green, and we're sitting around 15 kilometers to the west of Calgary. And the idea is that on the map on the right, you can see the Elbow River there, which is creeping along in the lower part of the diagram. And at that position number 2 there on the map, there's going to be some big floodgates that can open up when there's a flood event. The water will then pass along this canal, which is being created right now, and then up to number 6 there, the grade control structure, and then it will debouch out this water into this dry dam area, which is defined by this black margin here. So that will all be filled with water. So the water will sit there for about 10 days, and then once the risk of flooding is over, the low-level outlet, this position number 7 here on the map, they'll open the gates and the water will be put back out into the river. So it's basically a kind of holding ground for the river flood waters. So what we're going to do in the talk today is that we're going to make our way from south to north. So we're going to start off at number 1 at the auxiliary spillway and make our way up through the system. And we're going to look at some of the interesting structural, sedimentological, and paleontological features which have popped out during the study. So let's start off with a little background on the geology itself. So what we see here in this map on the upper right is that we have the bedrock geology. We have the older rocks to the southwest, younger to the northeast. So the rocks are basically dipping down towards the northeast. So we have the Brazo Formation here, the Coal Spur Formation, and the Paskapoo Formation. And we're going to be really focusing on these older 2 formations here, the Brazo and the Coal Spur. So these are uppermost Cretaceous in age. The KT boundary or the KPG boundary actually occurs somewhere within this Coal Spur Formation. We're going to be talking about that during the presentation. All of the sediments that we're going to be looking at today pretty much are terrestrial in character. So we will also see some exceptions to that, but this is the published data, and I'm going to show you at the end how this map has been updated based on the work that's been done on the site. Overlying these bedrock, the dipping bedrock, we have glacial deposits, a mix of glacial deposits with some moraine, some tills, glacial-lacustrine sediments, and we will look at those briefly as we go through the presentation, but we'll be focusing on the bedrock. So some of the geological data that we're able to collect, obviously there's a lot of excavation that's gone on, so we're going to be seeing lots and lots of photographs of the different features that have come up during the excavations. This is just one example here where trenching has been going on at the inlet, so that's where the water is going to be taken out from the river. And you can walk along these trenches and start collecting data, but there's also very long expanses of outcrop along the margins of the canal that were created as well. We also have shallow seismic data. We have some CPT data, cone penetrometer data that's been collected, and we have about 100 geotechnical cores that were collected as well. And I've chosen this core in particular because it's got some pretty interesting features, including coals, mudstones, and even some oyster beds, which we'll talk about in more detail in a moment. So the depositional character that I mentioned, it applies to pretty much the whole site. And what we're seeing here is interbeds of sandstone, siltstone, mudstone, and coals. And the sandstone beds, trough cross bedded at the base, some wavy laminae and ripples. And then we also see lateral accretion surfaces like we're seeing in this photograph at the upper right here. And these are interpreted as meandering channel deposits. Interbedded with these, we're seeing siltstones, which are often heavily rooted and possibly were deposited in backwaters of the rivers. And then we're seeing thick mudstones as well, which are the overbank deposits. We also see a variety of coals up to about 2 meters in thickness, which are representing peat swamps. And we see some extra beds like this bentonite bed here. So this is an ashfall deposit that was created by volcanics that were going on in the Rockies due to the Rocky Mountain building at this time. So the overall depositional setting is a gently dipping, temperate floodplain deposited in a terrestrial environment. In terms of structure, we're located in a very important structural nexus of the Rocky Mountains, which is called the Triangle Zone, where we have the thrusting here towards the west. So this thrusting is associated with the subduction of the Pacific Plate under the western margin of Canada. And then that interbeds and interfingers with the fallen basin deposits sitting over here towards the east. And at the point where we're looking here, we're right in the middle there in what's called the Triangle Zone. There's also supposed to be a thrust passing through this area. So that's one of the many thrusts that are associated with the Rockies mountain building. And this is called the Brazo Thrust, which stretches about 400 kilometers from Hinton in the north, so close to Jasper, which is quite famous in the Rockies, all the way down through this area and down towards the south. And we'll see evidence for this structural geology as we go through the presentation, but some of the smaller scale structural features that you come across are folded bedrock here. And you can see, if you look at this little photograph on the left here, that we've got highly contorted mudstones in here. We see small scale faulting in here as well on a meter scale. We see slickensides associated with the faulting. And then what we tend to see is that the sandstones are more competent. So the sandstones retain their relatively simple bedding characteristics, with the bedding dipping down typically towards the northeast. But the mudstones take up most of the contortion, and so they're heavily folded. And we can see here that these mudstones, I picked out some of the bedding planes in here to show how folded these mudstones are. So the mudstones are really providing the evidence for the contortion that's associated with that brazothrust. So we're going to begin our journey now. We're going to start off at the auxiliary spillway, so just on the southern side of the river. And what we see here is that we were lucky enough to have a bit of a geologist's dream. So what they were doing was that they flattened a surface here. This is the surface that they created. So if you look at that middle photograph on the right-hand side, they created a 160-meter long pavement, which was then covered with cement. But to make this pavement, they basically scraped away an area about 10 meters wide, 160 meters long, and then they vacuumed it with a hydrovac system to create a smooth, clean surface to which the cement would adhere to. So I got to see this incredible bedding surface here, cutting through all of the dipping beds and providing a lot of data on fractures, on the fossils. And this is an example here of a fossil shrub that we're seeing in cross-section, and also that we had an extra trench along the northern and the southern sides. So you can just see them on this photograph here, these two trenches to provide vertical sections as well. So we have a horizontal section and vertical sections as well. So I sent a small drone up, and the drone collected this data. So what we've done here is that I went onto this bedding plane with my geotechnical compadres, and we marked out all of the fractures using red paint. We also put a scale on here, so these green dots are 2 meters apart, and then we sent the drone up, and we were able to create a photo mosaic all the way along this surface from one end to the other. So we've got an unprecedented slice through the geology to look at the fractures. What I've also done here is to add the geological data, the sedimentological data, so that yellow is obviously sandstones, and the gray is the mudstones here. So we're seeing that there is contortion in here. These sandstones are not just simple channel features, but they are also showing some folding as well. So this is what the data look like from that slice, that horizontal slice. So what we see here is that we've got this lovely fracture pattern, which I've basically interpreted in Adobe Illustrator. And I've been able to create some fracture roses and look at the fracture data and then compare that to the Rocky Mountain trend. So the trend of the Rocky Mountains running down from northwest to southeast. And then we've also got the sedimentological data in here. So at the top, we've got this vertical slice showing the beds dipping down towards the south. And then we've also got this horizontal slice here with all the fractures, and also showing how the bedding is swinging around as you go from the northern end, which is at this end here, to the southern end of the outcrop. So all of this data here would never have been seen if it hadn't been for the creation of this spillway. Jumping across the river now. So as you can see on the map here, we've gone from the auxiliary spillway on the south side to the diversion inlet. And this is what it's going to look like if there is ever a flood. We have this debris barrier here. This is just a mock-up that was made by Alberta Transport to show what's going on. So that will stop any logs from going in. This is the diversion structure with these gates here, floodgates, and those floodgates will open and allow the water to debouch in and start making its way up the man-made canal towards the north. So this is what the area looked like from above while they were busy building this structure. And I've got this, I showed this diagram earlier here with the folded beds. So the folded beds are sitting in along here. And then we've got the sandstones, which are dipping more simply in between them. And we've got all of this outcrop here to start building a pattern. And you can see also there's this thin blue layer sitting in here, and that blue layer is an oyster bed. So most of the dips within this area are pretty much subvertical. So they're all associated with that brazothrust and thrusting and drag along the thrusts. So this is just a section running from north to south through that debris deflection barrier. So where the barrier is, this is for the base of the barrier. And you can see that once again, the mudstones are picking up all of the contortion. The sandstones are staying pretty competent. And then we've got a nice log section running through here, which I had plotted up, but I thought I'd just show you what it looks like when I'm logging it from the outcrop, with sandstones in there and this oyster bed and also some coals in there as well. We have to be careful with the coals because the coals are planes of weakness. And so they have to make sure when we're putting the pilings in that we're trying to avoid those coals as much as possible. So this is what we had to go on. So we had the core data here, which is showing this oyster bed within the core, but the core also shows the sandstone bed sitting there as well. So I've actually shown 4 different cores here. So you can start correlating the sandstones where the channels are running across the diversion inlet, and also seeing some of the other beds like this oyster bed that are sitting in there as well. So the cores, the recovery was very good, and I was able to log any cores that I needed to help me understand what was going on depositionally. So I mentioned the oyster bed, and the oyster bed is pretty significant here because, as I said earlier, this is a dominantly terrestrial depositional environment. So everything is terrestrial here, apart from this one oyster bed. So I contacted a few colleagues, particularly Dave Eberth, who works at the Tyrrell Museum, who's a very experienced sedimentologist, and we were trying to work out what this oyster bed represented, because obviously this is some kind of marine incursion. We were lucky enough to have good outcrops, so we could tell that it was not a thrust slice. This was actually a depositional event and was fitted in with the stratigraphy. So we had a transition from terrestrial sediments into the oyster bed and back into terrestrial sediments. And eventually we were able to correlate it to a maximum flooding surface sitting up here on this log. This core was collected about 15 kilometers away from here. So we've got the Dinosaur Provincial Park Formation and the Old Man Formation sitting down in here. So these are dinosaur-bearing terrestrial sediments that are exposed in Dinosaur Provincial Park. And then we have this marine incursion here called the Bear Paw Tongue, which is extending all the way over to Springbank. So the outcrops that I'm looking at with that 4 meters of oyster bed and associated marine deposits, also with one ammonite in there as well, that is basically the last hurrah of this Bear Paw Sea. So as you go towards the east, the Bear Paw Sea thickens and deepens to maybe 50 meters water depth with marine reptiles in it. But we are looking at just the very last tongue of that extension of the Bear Paw Sea stretching towards the west. Other exciting finds that we made here was that there was a flood deposit, an interpreted flood deposit here with these large colified logs. And in amongst the colified logs were dinosaur bones. So there's one little dinosaur bone arrowed there. There's a dinosaur rib bone arrowed here. And we even have one dinosaur tooth, which I interpret as being from a theropod, so a meat-eating dinosaur. So there's excellent evidence here that we've got dinosaurs that were living in these sediments, living in this environment back in the Cretaceous. And we don't find dinosaur bones throughout the site. And I believe the reason for that is that this fossil wood here and these big lumps of fossil wood are acting as some kind of buffer, which is presenting the dinosaur bones, preventing them from being dissolved. And meanwhile, in most of the site, they are being dissolved. We also see a lot of amber in here, but unfortunately, the pieces of amber are pretty small, and I haven't been able to pull any insects out from these as yet. Another possible piece of excitement here is that there are probable dinosaur footprints in some of these sediments. And this is once again a drone view from above. And what we see is these very equi-size nodules, siderite nodules, occurring in these beds. And I believe that these represent dinosaur footprints. So the footprint was made, the footprint then filled in with organic material, and then the organic material acted as a nucleus to create siderite nodules. And we have good analogs from Dinosaur Provincial Park, some 2 hours to the east of this site, where we're seeing similar nodules like this occurring on point bar deposits, which we are confident are related to dinosaur footprints. And before we move on from the inlet, I just wanted to show you this image here. So underneath we have the bedrock, and the bedrock's being worked on by this excavator here, this hoe, and the bedrock comes up through here, and then we have this very, very sharp contact overlying there, the Cretaceous sandstones, where we pass up into glacial till. So what's happening is that in glacial times, the glaciers have come through and just swept off all of the bedrock and created this flat surface here. And that's just an evidence of the power of the glacial deposits. Okay, so we're moving now from the diversion inlet where the water comes in, and we're going to make our way up through this channel, the diversion channel. So that's usually divided into channel south. Then there's a highway and then channel north. So we're going to make our way up through here, and I'm going to show you what some of the sediments that we saw in this area. So this is what the area looks like pretty much now as well. But what they are going to do is they're going to riprap all the way along here. So they're going to be putting large lumps of limestone along here that will protect these banks and stop them being eroded when the flood waters eventually come through here during flood season. So the geology here is structurally complex. We have this bentonite layers, more of these ash beds. We have coal layers as well, but you can see that all of these beds here are pretty steeply dipping, and the mudstones, as I said earlier, are very contorted as well. And what we see here is that the actual fault zone is about 60 meters in thickness that's associated with this brazothrust. We also see synclines and anticlines in here. So we've got these dipping beds sitting in here, and then we actually have beautifully exposed anticline sitting in here. This is the core of the anticline here with the bow tie on it. And then the beds come along here, and they're quite heavily folded through this area. And I was able to collect a lot of dip data, which I will show you a little bit of later on, to help to constrain the structural impacts and what's going on structurally. I mentioned the glacial deposits earlier, and that there are glacial features all the way across the site. So some of the features that you see is that you get these tills. So here's a till deposit here, forming this local high. And then we've got glaciolacustrean sediments which are draping off it. And the glaciolacustrean sediments are fantastic. So they're showing this lovely varving in here. So you can see these varves, and these varves are unusually thick. So this is a lake that was extending all the way to Calgary, so 15 to 20 kilometers long. And what you find is that the big rivers where the modern habitations are now built, so Calgary, Edmonton, other towns in Western Canada, they are usually built along the rivers. And at the time of when the glacial deposits were being laid down, a lot of ice damming was going on. So you had these large glaciolacustrean deposits formed in the lakes. So these are all glacial lakes. You also see some burrows in here as well. So these burrows are kind of 40 to 50,000 up to about 12,000-year-old burrows made by ground squirrels and gophers and things like that. So we see these fossil burrows, and it's worth looking to see if there are skeletons inside them of these small animals. We also see heavily contorted beds. So you can see along this surface here, the mudstones have this wiggly top to them. And this is all ice wedging that's associated with the passage of glacial material over the top of these syn depositional glacial deposits. And then there's also some rooting sitting in these beds as well. So interglacially, we're still getting good preservation of fossil plant material. We're now moving to the highway, which runs down through this area here on our map. It's Highway 22. And on that highway, we have an exposure of what's called the entrance conglomerate, or I like to call it the entrance conglomerate. So we can see this conglomerate layer here, and this conglomerate stretches for at least 500 kilometers along strike. So this is a very significant bed. So it's exposed on the highway, and you can see here that this is the contact where this conglomerate occurs. And I'm confident that this represents a fall in relative sea level. So the sea is sitting maybe 100 to 200 kilometers off to the east, the western epicontinental seaway that stretched from Alaska all the way down to Colombia at this time. So that seaway is there. So when the sea level falls in the seaway, that also creates a lack of accommodation space on shore in the terrestrial environment, and that leads to the deposition of conglomeratic beds with a lot of sediment bypass. So this is what the conglomerate looks like. We can see it in here. So this is a regionally correlatable interval. And while we were doing work on this bed, we also came across more dinosaur bones. So this is a ornithischian backbone here, a vertebra from a plant-eating dinosaur. And we found other bones in here as well. So this is exciting that we're finding more dinosaur material within these beds. And what's nice is that within the site itself, so not on the highway, but now we're moving towards the southeast in the middle of that channel that I mentioned earlier, and we actually find the same conglomeratic bed in the channel. So we're able to correlate them across. It took some looking because where it's exposed, you can see it's only one pebble thick, this bed. But to find these extra formational clasts is extremely unusual within these deposits. So it's something that once you see quartzite clasts in there and limestone clasts in there, you know that you're looking at this entrance conglomerate. There's also mudstone layers that are associated that have the same clasts in them. So this sometimes this is represented by a sandstone, and then laterally you'll see that this same bypass surface with the conglomerate on it is exposed in a mudstone environment as well. So nice to see this on site, and another example where this is actually exposed. But there's even more exciting news that we found a second conglomerate bed. So this is, I've called it the Springbank conglomerate after the site itself. We found bone material in here as well, which we interpret as dinosaur bones, but it's not. They're a bit rounded, these bones, so you can't be 100% certain. But this is a much thicker conglomerate. So this is up to about 30 centimeters thick, and this is something that's previously unreported. So this is representing another regional lowstand deposit across at least this area, and possibly more extensively across the province. So this is something that we should be looking for in other areas. Right, so let's move on to the emergency spillway now. So we've come up into the northern part of the channel. So we're close to where that big dry dam is on this little map, and on the top left-hand corner. So we're now in the emergency spillway area. This photograph that I put in here is just to show that we have these beautifully preserved three-dimensional seeds in here. So there's a lot of fossil plants. We did not expect this when the project started, but we probably found more fossil plants than anything else in this area. I've logged a lot of sections through here as well as part of the ongoing work. So this is the sedimentology side, the geotechnical side. So I've got sections that cover about 900 meters of stratigraphy through the site. So down into the Brazo, which we were looking at in the diversion inlet with the areas with the dinosaur bones. And then we pass up, we have the entrance conglomerate here, which is close to this, the contact between the Brazo and the coal spur formation. And then we log up into the coal spur formation for another 200 or 300 meters of section in there. And what we're seeing is that as you overlie this contact, you have a significant relative low stand. So we're stacking the fluvial deposits. And then as you go up, you start raising relative sea level and allowing more accommodation space and allowing more of the mudstone beds to be preserved as you go up section. And just to give you an idea, these are 5 meters apart, each of these numbers here on the scale. So that's about 100 meters of section that we're looking at there. So as I said, we have these stacked river channels at the base of the coal spur formation. So you can see here that we've got this stacking of the sandstones, one atop the other. Most little lateral depression in here. This is mostly trough cross-bedded sediments, so it suggests that we've got low sinuosity channels. And I've got this modern example here from New Zealand to show what the environment might have looked like at that time. So basically we're going from the Brazo formation with muddy deposits, basal contact with the conglomerate, and then up into these stacked sandstone deposits, which are stacked fluvial channels. Within this area, we also see some very nice fossils. So we've got fossil trees, and this tree here is actually in life position. So this is a vertical tree in gently dipping deposits. So this is it hasn't fallen over. This is literally preserved in life position. And when you look at the cross section through the tree, you can see it's got this coalified rim, so the bark, and then the inside has been replaced by sideratized mudstone. There's another fossil tree here towards the base of the base of this slide. And you can see this fossil tree here has these roots radiating out from the sides with a coalified trunk. And it doesn't show the typical circles here. And this is the rings that you would see on a normal tree. And this suggests that it is probably a metasequoia, so a tree that's still found in China today. And we also see other coalified deposits in here, and we see these unusual coal splits that are sitting in here as well. The cool thing about this, we're still in the Cretaceous, so that these trees, you could imagine that they would have been browsed upon by dinosaurs. There's also a nice microvertebrate site in this area. So this is the northern end of the spillway. So what happens is the channel is moving towards the north in this direction here, towards this green area. And then we've got an emergency spillway here if we do have too much flow that allows the water to debouch out earlier than necessarily running into the dry dam. And in this area here, in this stacked 4 meters of mudstone, we have a lot of shell beds, gastropod beds in there. And then associated with those gastropod beds, we have some vertebrate material, which is fantastic to see and probably suggests that this was deposited in kind of lake margin deposits. We see champsosaur vertebra, so this is champsosaur is a little bit like a crocodile. We see crocodile teeth. We also see turtle remains and fish skull remains as well. So that all of those are preserved in this part of the succession within this microvertebrate site. And we got 2 small dinosaur bones out of here as well, which were identified by Don Brinkman from the Royal Tyrrell Museum. So let's move to the outlet now. So we're getting close to the area. So this will be the way the dry dam sits, and this is showing it in flood. And then we're looking at this area here, just in the outlet. And what we see once again, we've got this lovely section here, log section, with about 125 meters of continuous section. And you can see here that I've marked the KPG boundary on there, and we'll talk about that in a moment, how that presents itself. So first of all, one of the discoveries in this area was what I call the delicate leaf beds. You're allowed to name any fossil beds that you find as you wish, and they were just so beautifully preserved. I gave them that name. So we have sycamore leaves in here, which are shown on the right. We have beech leaves here with the straighter margins. We have metasequoia frontlets, and as I said, they're still found in places like China today and Japan. This is what the modern ones look like, and these are the ancient ones. And then we've even got some seeds sitting in here as well. So a nice variety of plants. And from this one bed, we got 13 species of tree and another 40 species of plants that were found in here. So that incredible richness of ancient plant life. We also see a lot of invertebrate fossils in here, and that includes unionid beds. This is unionid sitting in here, which are freshwater bivalves, and they're quite interesting animals. They still live in our rivers in Alberta today. And to go through their entire metamorphosis from little wigglers up into grown-up bivalves, they need to go into fish's gills to mature. So each of these animals has been through a fish's gills to mature. This is what the shell beds look like that I mentioned earlier, with lots of small gastropods in them and pisidiid bivalves, little small bivalves. And then this is just a paleo reconstruction here, which I actually put together for Paleocene deposits, but it applies equally well to our Cretaceous deposits here. So one of the things that was a huge surprise to us was finding freshwater oncoids. So oncoids are basically algal growths. They're usually formed by concentric structures. You can just about see here the concentric structures that are growing. So the algae is growing, and they normally grow in shallow marine deposits, but they can also grow in freshwater deposits. And this is an example of thrombolites from Australia, this picture from Heidi Allen. But we are also seeing these oncoids at Springbank. So when I first found them, I thought, oh, is this another marine incursion? But no, these are fluvial oncoids that are being found. So you can see some of these oncoids here are up to about 25 centimeters in length. And we found them in this boulder pile. They'd just been excavated from over here. We couldn't find exactly where they come from. So we've only got within about the closest 5 meters to where these oncoids were actually situated in situ. So freshwater oncoids, when you find them in rivers, you still find them in a few rivers today. The River Als in Germany is one example. You also find them in salars in Chile and places like that as well. So they do occur in the modern, and they usually signal unusual changes in fluvial geochemistry. So when I found these ones at this one horizon within the coal spur, we knew that the KPG boundary, the Cretaceous tertiary boundary, lay somewhere within the coal spur formation. And I wondered whether that oncoid bed is a marker indicating this KPG boundary. And I had an analog from northeast Spain. So this is from Tremp. So in Tremp, you have what's called the reptile bed down here with fossil dinosaur bones in it. You have this oncoid bed here, which is about 50 centimeters in thickness. And then up above that, you basically have the KT boundary, and they've got geochemical evidence that shows that you have this change here into tertiary deposits overlying. So I took some samples through my oncoid bed and from just under my oncoid bed. And what I found, I took 21 samples, and 20 of them gave trace values. But fortunately, the 21st sample, which is from just below where the oncoids are in a kind of giant leaf bed, gave 7 parts per billion. So this is about 7,000 times background. So this is clear evidence that we have some kind of impact event, and most likely that this represents the KT boundary. So we were able to identify the KT boundary based on these giant oncoids, which is really pretty special. And this is the first time that this kind of boundary has been reported from anywhere in North America, and obviously gives us the excitement to go and see whether we can find this in other areas as well. So I'm just going to summarize here. First of all, I'm just going to tell you about this plant fossil. So we found one of the discoveries I made was a whole new family of fossil plants. They're busy being described by the Royal Tyrrell Museum at the moment, so I'm not allowed to show you what the fossil plants look like, but they're very odd, very knobbly, and very distinctive. And they occurred on this giant boulder here. So you can see that boulder there. And actually, when we excavated this boulder and brought this boulder up to be taken back to the museum, it was too big. So the museum staff had to come back again with rock saws and cut it down to size. So it's busy being studied at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. Hopefully it will be going on display sometime this year and be published. And then I'll be able to actually show you what this plant looks like in the flesh. So in my summary here, first of all, I'm putting in this diagram, which is a bit of a phantasmogram. But what I'm showing here is that we've got the divergent inlet down here, so towards the southwest. And you can see I put in the vertical dips sitting in here. I put in my anticlines and synclines that I was able to map out. We see a completely different type of dip on the south side of the river, so dipping down towards the south. So what I assume from this is that we've got a fault running along the river, which is separating these vertically dipping sediments in the north from these sediments dipping towards the south. And so I put a fault in there. And then as you go up through the stratigraphy, we go up through the new Springbank conglomerate sitting in here. We have the entranced conglomerate that I found in that channel and also at the highway. So we're able to correlate it along here. And then as you go up here, we go into the KT boundary where the oncoids were found sitting up here. And I've got all of the dip data. I've got hundreds of values for the dip data and some cross sections through here just to show you that we're able to put together a new structural picture of what's going on. In terms of deposition, this is what a very broad summary of what we've seen today. So we saw that dinosaur bed down at the bottom. We saw the oyster bed sitting in here. We saw the Springbank conglomerate and the entrance conglomerate up here, associated with sandy deposits, and then they became more muddy upwards. And then finally, we had the KT boundary at the top. So what I've done is that I've appended a sea level curve to this with a lower sea level, the low stands down here where we have the conglomerates and we have the sandy deposits, and then a rise in relative sea level where we see the muddier deposits. And then we have this high stand sitting where we saw that oyster bed. So that will be the maximum extent of flooding from the seaway that runs to the east of Springbank itself. So just to summarize, this project, I've been basically visited the site about 600 times over the last 3 years. We've been able to refine the stratigraphy. So we have a new marine incursion, 2 conglomerate beds, and now we have the KT boundary identified on site, and then significant paleontological discoveries, including the dinosaur bone bed, delicate leaf beds and seas, a new fossil family, and then other dinosaur material that occurs throughout the site. And we've got a brand new structural interpretation as well. And I just want to finish off by saying that this really shows the Alberta Heritage Act in action. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, so great presentation. And I just would like to remind all of our audience that the chat is now open for questions. So please do type in your questions and I'll read them out. And while also typing in your questions, please do specify where you're from so that we get to know where you're from. So I don't see any questions now. But then I might have a question. So you do see a spatial variation in the paleontological finds, as in from south to north, as in
Yes.
terms of size and all of those two, or
Yes.
has
So
that been?
I've actually learned that the place to look for the dinosaur fossils is in those flood beds. And that's probably because there's higher energy there, so they can move the bones, and also because the wood seems to provide a buffer that preserves the fossil bones. So first of all, wherever I see those flood deposits, and there's probably about 10 to 15 of those flood beds, that's been a good place to look for dinosaur bones. And then we're also seeing that the shell beds, where with the small shells, they only occur in the upper part of the succession. And we're pretty sure that those shell beds, the reason they're preserved is because they're lake margin deposits, because of the gastropods are actually, that they're like marine, well, they're water, they're not land snails, they're water snails. So we're seeing a change from a more terrestrial environment to a more lacustrine environment as we go up towards the north. And that's directly reflected by what we see in the paleontology. So yeah, that's good question.
Thank you. I still don't see any question.
Oh, is that good or bad?
Oh no, actually there is a question right now. So this question is from George from Beaverton, Oregon. And he says, great talk. Does the heritage law include allowance for requiring design change or some type of preservation if the findings are deemed very significant?
Yes, that's a really good question. So, I mean, it's funny because I was thinking of London, and in London where they find archaeological remains, and they insist on companies when they're building their skyscrapers that they put a kind of glass floor in to preserve the things underneath. So we do have a few sites that have been preserved. We've even had a few excavations where the excavations have been moved to one side or another to actually preserve some of these geological discoveries. But generally speaking, what happens is that we find them. We work with the museum staff and we actually excavate the fossils and take them out so that the project can continue. So there have been relatively few examples where we've actually preserved the material in situ. Generally speaking, it goes to the museum.
Okay. All right.
So there have been some great examples from the oil sands. So in the oil sands, they've taken out several marine reptiles and the amazing Borealopelta that had the material preserved, had food preserved in its stomach and things like that. And so that's an example where they did actually excavate those fossils and took them back to the museum, but they may have stopped the work on site for maybe a week or two. We had one example where we found fossil mammal remains on a housing estate. And so the people had to wait to move into their house. And so they said to them, well, would you, we found this discovery. Would you like to have a special behind the scenes tour at the Tyrrell Museum and go and see all the dinosaurs? And the people said, no, we just want to get in our house. They weren't even interested, which is crazy. And they had a significant mammal bed in their basement, basically, in the basement of their new home that they were waiting to have built. They were disappointed it was there, which is sad.
Okay, so there's another question from Teresa, Vienna. So great talk. The oncoids are very interesting. Some of them record the Cretaceous boundary and some don't. Do you think they could be from two different oncoid beds, or how do you explain the different recording?
Yeah. So the oncoid bed that I found, this particular one, just occurs over about 30 centimeters. So it's very well defined. And you have oncoids in there from a tenth of a centimeter up to about 25 centimeters in length. But there are other oncoid beds that do occur within the Paleocene succession. So I didn't see them at Springbank, but I see them closer to Calgary. So somebody told me about these and I went to see them, and there are small oncoids in there. So I think that the KT boundary is marked by the big oncoids, but there are other oncoidal beds that are just associated with local changes in geochemistry. And the ones in the modern River Alps, the reason why those ones are there, it's thought because they have there's a phosphate spike, and that phosphate spike has helped to kind of like help them to be deposited and to be preserved as well. So it is unusual geochemistry, but I think the KT boundary is kind of super unusual. You can imagine there were these wildfires across the world and huge amounts of pollution in the rivers, natural pollution, and that probably allowed the algae to flourish because all of the fish were killed off by all of the material that was being washed into the rivers. I've actually got a presentation. There's the virtual paleontology conference on right now, which I would tell you where it was, but it's just online. So it's the fifth virtual paleontology conference, and I have a presentation just on the oncoids on there. Or if you want to see another presentation on the oncoids, I have a YouTube channel, which is a free site, so you don't have to pay to go and see it. So you can have a look at more information about the oncoids on there as well.
Sure, which we have just put in the chat box for anyone to go through. Great. I do not see any questions. So if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap up for today. I think there'll be more questions once this gets uploaded on YouTube and so on.
Yeah, feel free to email me. I have a very simple Hotmail address, johnno@hotmail.com. So if you have any more questions or you want any of the material, any of the slides or anything like that, just let me know. And I should just say that all of these pictures were shot on site, and that bear in the middle is literally walking across one of my outcrops where there's a gastropod bed just to his left or her left. So all of these animals were seen on site, and I saw moose as well, but I couldn't get a good picture because it was pouring with snow. So it's really great area for wildlife.
Sure. So Jaco says great talk, and with that, I think there are no more messages in the chat, so I think I'll wrap up. So again, thank you all for joining for this month's talk, and don't forget to join us next month on the 9th of April, where David Kemp will talk about the geological evidence for hydroclimate changes and the sedimentary responses to extreme warming. See you then. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, everyone.